Right, thank you. Okay, so my objectives really are just to say a little bit about what mood disorder is from the perspective of a psychiatrist, when people get it and why we think they get it. To link that to the role of sleep, which has already been sort of emerging from what Russell said, and from the emphasis on well-being and sleep that's come out of the historical talk. And then talk a little bit about what the potential is for intervention and treatment. So I thought I'd start with, I'm a psychiatrist, so I get people referred to me who have got a depressive episode, and I'm seeing them in secondary care, and that means that they've been through the primary care filter, and that means that they've probably got severe illness or they've got refractory illness, they're not getting better. And I think it's striking that if we take those people and we follow them up, their life expectancy is actually dramatically reduced compared to the normal population. So this is life expectancy at the age 15 for the normal population, and for someone who has a history of only one, not often, obviously often more, but has had contact with secondary services for psychiatry. And you can see at the age of 15, the probability that that person will live to the average age of the population is reduced by about 14 years. Now that effect sort of wears off with time, but it's in a way a shocking thing to think about, because that's not the way we tend to think about depression, but that's actually the way a psychiatrist has to think about depression, as a serious illness. And we use the word illness without too much apology, even though it's somewhat fashionable to try and destigmatize mental illness by calling it something else. But it's hard not to get away from the fact that this is something that shortens lives. And it's in common with many other of the more severe illnesses that we see. Now, what is it? Well, DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, to give it its full title, really has changed the way in which we can count and research psychiatric disorder. Until about 1980, the tradition, particularly in America, was very dominated by analytical thinking, and so people didn't really, they moved to the level of the individual in offering formulations of people's psychiatric illnesses. And that really made it impossible to count and to do systematic research on populations. And ultimately in medicine we only get anywhere when we consider populations. So the key thing in 1980 was that we adopted a more systematic way of identifying cases of depression and indeed any other form of disorder that we're interested in. And it's a sort of Chinese menu approach in that we say, here are 9 symptoms that we know are very common in depression, and we require to say that someone has crossed a threshold which is clinically relevant, that they have at least 5 of these symptoms and they have them for at least 2 weeks. That's quite a low bar, but a bar it is nevertheless. And so it isn't a matter of, and it's something we can usually agree about and be moderately reliable about. And what are these symptoms that we think are so important? Well, just to underline, many of them are quite physiological, if you like. They're quite expressions of the body as much as expressions of the mind. And of course, in many ways actually, Descartes did us no favours by identifying the mind as a sort of separate dimension of space or absence of space. So this is what you have to complain of to a psychiatrist in order to get this diagnosis. Now we additionally subdivide and think about, this is what a major depressive episode would look like. These occur in a lifetime context where most people have a unipolar illness course, so they only ever get depression. These depressions are often recurrent, and the symptoms are sometimes chronic. This may be short of being fully impaired in the way that people often are when they have an acute episode, but they nevertheless rumble on, and many cases in general practice are like that. And we're only starting to understand how impairing that potentially is. It's under-researched. Bipolar disorder I'm not going to talk very much about, but just to say people with bipolar disorder have episodes of mania or hypomania, and this has some implications for how we offer treatments, but I'm not going to get into that because it's not germane to the conversation today. When do these episodes begin? Well, this shows you the age in years and the cumulative incidence in time of a range of these disorders, and the most common is unipolar depression, and these are all scaled up so that they're, sort of speak, out of 100% on this graph, so that you can look at all these different manifestations of mood disorder, and you can see that they all pretty much have an onset in the teenage years. And this is why, for these serious illnesses, we've got to take the problems of young people extremely seriously. And the big challenge, as I'm going to show, is to try and move our attention to the prevention and treatment of that age group, because they often don't get treated. We did a very simple survey in Oxford, and we did it online. We did a completely parallel thing with Stanford, and we were sort of, in a sort of jokey sort of way, wondering whether the rainy riverside dwelling of Oxford would compare unfavourably with the green pastures and sun of Stanford. And the interesting thing is that the data were pretty much identical. So this is a thing that you see. Obviously, there are many things that they have in common, privileged young people coming to elite university, but at the same time, they're having the same frequency of major depressive episodes by the age of about 19. And the onset, as you can see here, on average, was about 40. So this is a problem that starts, however badly it ends, it starts in young people. What are the causal pathways? Well, we think of it really in terms of I guess, three sort of sections. One is vulnerability. The other is precipitating things that might happen which gets depression started, and things that may maintain it. And these ideas were really derived once people started having the tools for measurement, which, as I say, was only in the latter part of the last century. These ideas initially came from social scientists doing science and thinking entirely about these factors in social terms. In fact, we're kind of increasingly borrowing genetic models to understand these as well, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But just to illustrate how these things interact, if you take people with different levels of neuroticism, which is basically the trait of anxious worrying, we've all got it a bit, but some of us got it quite a lot. But if you subdivide people into those categories and you look at the impact over a 2-year period of various kinds of social stress, let's use that word, from none to severe, you can see that their interaction is such that people who have high levels of neuroticism will not actually have much of a risk of getting depressed if they don't encounter major stresses. But if they do, the probability becomes extremely high. So it almost becomes predictable. And the same is true for men, and the same is true for women. And the data for men and women in relation to this kind of defined state of depression is extremely similar. In fact, women show a little greater heritability than men, and men show a little more evidence of more specific ranges of life events affecting their outcomes, but otherwise extremely similar. Now, you can construct a very complex model, and all that I've done here is to show the things that seem to make a difference when you try and predict from these kinds of features of people's personality, be it neuroticism, early abuse and neglect, conduct disorder. They interact with these more recent things to produce episodes. And if you take all of the data you can collect in very large groups of young people, what you can show is that you have about a 50% probability of predicting whether or not they get depressed within the next year. So you could say that because we know quite a lot about these antecedent vulnerabilities, that prediction of the onset of problems is nearly possible. The difficulty is that the actual detection and the actual identification for treatment is difficult because people are slow to recognize and acknowledge depression per se. There's a good deal of stigma still that attaches to admitting functional impairment, and we know this from talking to students, and the difficulties that they have in seeking help, the thresholds they perceive that prevent them seeking help. And what would be ideal is a neutral marker of depression onset. And this is where we link up to sleep, because sleep disturbance, and insomnia in particular, precedes these major depressive episodes. So if you think about this symbolically, you can have vulnerable individuals exposed to a variety of life events. Life events can be thought of as either independent things, which happen to you as a result of external forces beyond your control, but just as often they're actually results of you choosing a relatively high-risk environment. So in a funny sort of way, even genetic determinists think that life events are kind of part of their territory as well, even though they originated as much more of a social formulation. We think that life events could conceivably, and from all we've been talking about, we know that sleep is disrupted and circadian function is disrupted by these stressors, and that provides a precursor to these symptoms. And in addition, just as Russell was indicating, we're quite interested in this metabolic endocrine disturbance because the loss of the mortality that we see in depression, much of it is actually due to increased rates of physical illness. It's not just about suicide, which is the obvious thing and risk that attaches to major depression. So this is, if you like, the pathway, and this is one of the targets that we can potentially identify, which serves some of the purposes of, first of all, being neutral. People don't mind telling you their sleep's a problem. They might be much less keen to tell you that they were profoundly depressed and thinking about killing themselves. It's got the potential for intervention, and it may actually be on this pathway and prevent the onset of symptoms. So what can we do about sleep? Have we got ways of actually improving it? Because so far we've talked about it as a kind of a variable that's intermediate between stresses on the one hand, other problems on the other, influenced by the environment. What can we do to change it? And in addition, do we know that it's an important marker? So we did a very simple study looking in the student population. We actually simply surveyed students at random, and we asked them about their sleep problems, and we asked them about their psychological difficulties. And what we're able to show, and this is probably hopeless for everybody in the room, my apologies, but we could identify a high-risk group classified on the basis of psychiatric symptoms, and that was a whole range of things, including depression, including psychotic experience. And we could group people who had relatively high scores on this. They don't have mental illness, as we've talked about. They don't have schizophrenia, they don't have manic depression, but they have symptoms that are related to that. They're on a spectrum which is on the way to those conditions. And there's a high-risk group, medium-risk group, and low group. And what was very interesting was that in those three groups, we get high levels of sleep disturbance. So these low scores on this sleep indicator indicate that if you're in the high-risk group, you have insomnia. It's simply related. And therefore, if you identify insomnia, you are automatically identifying into that group people at high risk of psychiatric disorder. Now, do we have a way of intervening that is simple, cheap, effective? And in fact, it turns out that we do, and this is work of colleagues in Oxford who've produced an online cognitive behavioural therapy for chronic insomnia. And it's delivered via an app which one downloads from the internet for a fee, or if you're in the right health area, you increasingly may get it for free. And the idea is that it offers you CBT-inspired treatment, and the focus is on your thoughts about sleep, your daily schedule, your lifestyle, your bedroom, and also on restricting the time that you actually spend in bed not sleeping. And that's the focus provided by an animated therapist, and you don't think there's much choice of accent, and most of the time it's Scottish. But there you go. It's very pleasing. There's a community of users, and you can interact with them. And the data can be collected in a pretty frictionless way for the investigator, although it has to be obviously entered by the people using the app. And there are terrific advantages to this because everything that you do to contact the individual can be done online and automatically and through a computer, and all the data can be collected in the same way, and much of the analysis can be automated. So that you acquire, and this is one of the extraordinary things for this sort of observational science, incredible amounts of data very, very quickly, and you recruit people very seamlessly. And this was a very nice study that Colin and his colleagues did in Glasgow. And what they look at here, this is the sleep efficiency achieved at 80%, 85%, and 90% levels. And this shows you the number of individuals following either this CBT therapy or a control therapy, which was called IRT, or treatment as usual, which is no treatment at all. And what I hope you can see here is that there are large numbers of people in the CBT group post-therapy who are doing very well, are getting 70% of them have got this 80% level, and you've got almost half of them at 90%. And this is statistically significantly better than this IRT group and the treatment as usual group. And the great thing about this study is that many psychotherapies compare themselves to nothing at all, which is actually not that high a bar to hit. Whereas this actually compared itself to a phony therapy, a therapy that occupied you, distracted you, but didn't have ingredients which would help you sleep. And it's a very clever and excellent thing to do. And so it argues for once that we have a genuinely specific cognitive behavior therapy which actually works. And this is very unusual. This is the best example of an evidence-based psychotherapy that we have, in my opinion. And it's also highly utilizable on large populations. So this is the study that was alluded to by Russell, and it was primarily designed to look at these psychotic symptoms of paranoia, suspiciousness, and hallucinations or hallucinatory experience. And the point about this is we did it in 26 universities. All of the effort was in getting the ethical approval. The study itself was very, very straightforward because we recruited people online by simply sending students a link, and if they had insomnia, they could link with us, and we got almost 3,000 patients into this study. And, whoops, I haven't got what I expected to see there. Yeah, so these are the results. So this is the control, and this is the people who didn't receive any treatment. And this is the levels at week 10, and these are the changes. And you can see, because this is a huge study, it's the biggest study that's ever been conducted in the mental health field. You can see the huge statistical significance, so we can be very confident about these differences. And there are significant and important differences in the insomnia scores for these people. So we know that this treatment works. But in addition, even though it's not aimed at treating depression or anxiety, it is treating depression and anxiety. So these are young people. In this group, 60% of them scored at a level which would, in general practice, qualify as having a depressive episode. And you can see here that the mean scores on these ratings for depression fall by something like 25% for both depression and anxiety. So the implication is that if you used and offered this extremely simple to use app to intervene in young people who have sleep disturbance, you will treat the sleep disturbance, but you will also treat about 25% of the symptoms that you are seeing in that population of depression and anxiety. And I think that's an optimistic first step in starting to think about how we help young people more generally with the related problems of anxiety and depression. So I'll stop. I hope what I tried to convince you is that mood disorder is serious. It can be very serious for people who have refractory disorders that don't respond to treatment and require secondary care. It's somewhat predictable, but it's not very well treated at the moment. The role of sleep is probably important in mediating the transition between stress and the depressive episodes that we recognize. And sleep problems are not stigmatized in the same way that psychiatric problems are. And so for that reason, we have an early intervention that seems to work, it seems to be acceptable, accessible and cheap. And so what we think we need to move on to do is to think about how sleep becomes the first step in helping people with mental health problems in the younger population. And there's a great deal to do how that first step gets translated into next steps, because we know that many people are not going to be helped, even if some are. So thank you very much for your attention, and thanks to my colleagues, Russell and others, who helped with this work.